Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to this special webinar co-hosted by the Justice Health Group, Curtin University and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our speaker, Anne Hollonds, the National Children's Commissioner. Anne and I had an opportunity for a quick chat before things started, and there's certainly plenty to discuss. I don't want to steal too much from Anne's time. But for those of you who don't know Anne, prior to being the National Children's Commissioner, she ran the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and prior to that, about 23 years as the CEO of various organisations. Anne is a psychologist by training, and has an incredible reputation around the country. And what's precipitated this webinar, of course, is the Help Way Earlier report that the National Children's Commission has recently published. And Anne's going to give a brief overview of that report. No slides. We're here to have a conversation. And after that, it's an opportunity to just have a conversation and pick Anne's brains and just explore what next and what this might mean. Before I do hand over to Anne, I wanted to very quickly hand over to Professor Sharon Goldfeld, who heads up the population health team in the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, among other things, who's also just going to give a quick welcome and a few words as well. Sharon, over to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you for having me here today. I'm coming to you from Ghana country here in South Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and of course any First Nations people here with us today. I've actually stepped out from a conference that I'm here at, so hence the lanyard. I don't normally walk around with lovely blue lanyards. So first of all, I want to just say how wonderful it is to have this webinar, and certainly on behalf of the MCRI, I've got two very wonderful people who are sharing the next hour with you, which is Stuart, who heads up our Justice Health Group in Population Health, and Anne Hollonds, who's a great friend and colleague who I've known for a very long time, and we share our passion for rabble-rousing. And this report is really part of that, that very thoughtful rabble-rousing. It's not surprising, isn't it? Is it that at the heart of what Anne's going to be talking about with Stuart is this kind of fundamental inequity we have for children in this country that plays out in all sorts of adverse ways, the most extreme of which is, of course, having our young children in justice, but that is just the tip of a very large iceberg of inequity that plays out into what we see for children as they track through school, and then into the community. Those inequities, of course, play out into adulthood and into the chronic disease kind of epidemic that we're seeing in adulthood. So there really is a moment in time now with these very, very large canaries in mines, with children in the justice system, thinking about what on earth are we doing as a country that could be different? How on earth are we positioning ourselves to be kind? How on earth are we making a difference for children, both in justice, in the justice system, which already is, unbelievably and gobsmackingly awful, and that we tolerate it is just extraordinary. But what are we doing actually before that we could and should be making a difference, where we know how to make a difference and yet fail to do that with the level of intensity really needed? So this is going to be an extraordinary conversation, I know, because both Stuart and Anne can talk for a long time. So if there are any questions, get in early. And I'm just delighted on behalf of MCRI to be part of the team that's helped to host this. So back to you, Stuart and Anne, and I'm sure everyone's in for a great treat.
Thanks very much, Sharon. And look, just before handing over to Anne, I want to acknowledge the custodians of the lands that we're all meeting on. I'm on Adjunct Budja, and want to pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. Obviously, always important, but particularly poignant given the topic of today's webinar and the appalling overrepresentation of Australia's First Nations peoples in the criminal justice system. So look, I'd invite you, as well as Anne starts to speak, if you'd like to, just to acknowledge the country that you're coming from in the chat, just to acknowledge the diverse peoples that are whose lands that we're on today. So look, with no further ado, and I'll hand over to you. Please share your expertise. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Stuart, and thank you very much for this opportunity with such an expert group of people. Much of what I'll be talking about will be familiar to you, but I hope that we can have a conversation about, well, what do we do about it, basically? These are problems that we've known for a long time. I'm on the lands of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to all First Nations people joining today as well. So, as Stuart said, I'm just going to do a quick sort of a high-level scan of the report. If you want to look at it yourself, you just Google "Help Way Earlier," it should pop up. This report builds on decades of royal commissions and inquiries and international evidence. In fact, as part of this project, we actually scanned 12 years worth of royal commissions and inquiries, and we found the recommendations repeated again and again, over 3,000 of them over a 12-year period. And, that tells us a lot about the lack of accountability for action. We received submissions, conducted interviews and roundtables with community and family members and experts. But at the heart of this report are the voices of over 150 children who have been or are at risk of contact with the criminal justice system. And the title of the report is actually from what one young person said to me that echoed what many others said: we need help way earlier. These children told me that what they need is just the basics for a good childhood: a safe home, food to eat, clothes to wear, health care, a school and community where they feel they belong, connection to culture, and families who can support them. These basics are what helps kids stay out of trouble with the criminal justice system. But the reality is, as you all know, that these systems that are meant to help children and their families are fragmented, they're out of date, and they're uncoordinated. They're not fit for purpose for what some have described as an epidemic of unmet needs today. So child justice, we know, is considered to be a state and territory issue alone. But the Help Way Earlier report finds that in Australia, we've actually misunderstood the problems that we're trying to solve. We thought that the criminal justice system could fix, crime by children, but it's actually not able to reduce offending by children and make the community safer. The evidence shows that the younger a child comes into contact with the criminal justice system, the more likely it is that they'll go on to commit more serious and violent crimes. So a more punitive justice system is the wrong approach. More policing, longer sentences, tougher bail laws, more children's prisons. And as if you follow the media, you'll know that's exactly what's happening in several of the jurisdictions right now. That's the direction we're going in, a more punitive justice system. Punishment in the justice system does not work for prevention of crime by children. That's because offending by children is a symptom of underlying causes that we're failing to address. What we need to do is to pivot towards the solutions based on this decades of evidence to transform our approach and work together across the Federation on these underlying causes of crime. This requires a public health approach involving the portfolios of health, education, social services and Indigenous affairs at least, and it requires that we work together across the Federation, because this is not something that states and territories alone can fix. And I think that's been proven, that the states and territories have failed. Currently, there's no mechanism to work on this together across the Federation, unlike other critical and complex issues like women's safety, which is a key priority for National Cabinet. Other issues like housing and homelessness also used to be considered state and territory issues, but is now a National Cabinet priority. But child safety and wellbeing is not a priority for National Cabinet. If you look at the key priorities list, you won't see the word children anywhere on the list of priorities for National Cabinet. And that's one of the many elephants in the room. So there's no pathway for coordinated reform based on evidence, and no accountability despite frequent tragedies and widespread systems failure. These children are the most vulnerable children in this country. Most of them have complex needs, such as housing and food insecurity, early disengagement or suspension from school, experience of poverty, disadvantage and systemic racism, health and mental health issues, neurodevelopmental and cognitive disabilities and learning problems, and most have experienced domestic, family and sexual violence and other child maltreatment and trauma. Many of these children are involved in the child protection system, and then the next station on the train line that they're on is the criminal justice system. This journey is predictable, and importantly, it's preventable. So the Help Way Earlier report makes 24 recommendations, some of which can be enacted by separate jurisdictions today. The top 4 at the high level, I'll just mention those. The first one is a National Task Force for Reform of Australia's Child Justice Systems and a 10-year roadmap for reform based on the evidence. So the idea there is, as with those other critical and complex issues like women's safety, we bring everyone together to the table. We learn from those jurisdictions that are perhaps struggling slightly less. Everyone's struggling with this, but some are struggling more than others, and that by working together, we let everyone's boats rise. And also, we pool our resources across the Federation so we can do a proper scan internationally, because internationally there are very interesting things happening with a number of jurisdictions now closing youth detention centres altogether, including in the US. The second high-level recommendation was Cabinet Minister for Children, and then Ministerial Council for Child Wellbeing reporting to National Cabinet. So that would be a multidisciplinary council for child wellbeing, looking at all the unique needs of children across the different portfolios and providing advice to governments on that. And then the fourth one is legislation to protect the human rights of children, consistent with our obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other international conventions. Currently, we have nothing. So our ratifying of the Convention on the Rights of the Child back in 1990 is as good as meaningless when you look at what's happening now in the Northern Territory, in Queensland, and sadly also Stuart in WA as well. I'll say a bit more about WA in a minute. We need to put much more attention on prevention and redirect resources to address the underlying causes, including by fixing how our health and education systems operate so that they are fit for purpose and able to help children and their families as early as possible and at every stage of childhood. So often when I talk about, what I call the early warning systems of health and education that should be working better to identify and address the problems that can be picked up very early, to prevent this predictable trajectory. The shock jocks will say to me, well, that's all very well, Commissioner. Yes, of course we need to get in early, but what about the 11-year-old who's going around, punching grannies and stealing their purses, right? And so my answer to that is that it's the same for the 11-year-old who's doing that. It's the same for the 12-year-old who's stealing cars. It's the same for the kids who are in detention now, and especially the same when they leave detention. We have to address their underlying needs. If we want to prevent crime and prevent more crime, we have to be addressing their needs at every stage of childhood. Otherwise, we're wasting our time. And in fact, if we don't do this, and if we don't work together on this across the Federation, in my view, we will still be here in 10, 20 years' time having the same conversation. The other of the 24 recommendations go to improved prevention and early intervention, as well as the need to redesign the child justice system itself based on evidence and human rights. And that's what will help to make our communities safer. The Help Way Earlier report also asks, why are we persisting with approaches that don't work? And it addresses the barriers to reform that we rarely talk about. And it's clear that just presenting the data and the evidence about how to prevent offending by children is not sufficient to get the governments to act. What we heard from experts was quite confronting. we heard that we're letting politics get in the way of prevention. The barriers to acting on the evidence include the way our governments operate in this federation and a lack of political will and courage. The federation itself is a barrier to properly addressing the underlying causes of offending by children. For example, child justice, as I said, is seen only as a state and territory issue, and there is currently no mechanism for us to work together across the federation on this, and that needs to change. I often say that our most vulnerable children are victims of federation failure because they sit awkwardly at the intersections of the jurisdictions and they're falling in the gaps. We need to make this federation work for all of us, all our citizens, including our youngest citizens. And I think we've all probably had enough of talk and tinkering with the symptoms. We need to pivot towards the solutions to transform our approach and work together across the federation on those underlying causes of crime that by children that we've been failing to address, and that's what will keep the community safer. And finally, these children are themselves victims of crime and maltreatment, and these children are members of our community, but their story is rarely heard, making it easy to demonise them and dehumanise them. Australia can be smart on crime by acting on the evidence, dealing with the barriers to reform, and building safe communities where children can get the best start in life. Thank you very much. That's all I wanted to say at the high level, but really happy to go wherever you want to take it, Stuart, and those joining today.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's a terrific overview. And for everybody, I've pasted a link to the report in the chat. So if you haven't yet accessed that report, I'd strongly encourage you to do so. It's a terrific read and saying some very important things. Look, can I invite folks to please put their cameras on? We have this opportunity to have a chat with Anne for the rest of this hour. And so I'll invite you to put on your camera and I'll try to field questions. And so if you can just put up your hand using the function, I'll try to take people's questions in order and hand them over to Anne. And if I may, just before starting, just to reflect on what you've said, a couple of the key takeaways for me. The first is, and I think it's implicit in what you've said, and the title of the report even, is this failure to appreciate the contact with the criminal justice system, particularly for young children. It's a symptom of upstream issues. And so, the implication of that, it seems to be, is that it's not a criminal justice issue. This is about a community well-being, prevention and equity issue. So it's not, there's this misapprehension that this is a criminal justice issue, whereas that criminal justice contact is a symptom of other issues. And so help way earlier clearly is what we need to do. Another thing that I took from it, and perhaps that aligns with the work that my group does, is that at the same time, it's not a false dichotomy. So let's stop young children ending up in the criminal justice system, but let's not also compound that by failing those children who do end up in the system. So we need to prevent and support. And then the other thing that perhaps will be a focus of discussion today is just this remarkable reluctance of the federal government to engage in this space. So yes, criminal justice is a state and territory issue, at least from a legislation perspective. But clearly we're talking about more than criminal justice here. We're talking about health equity. We're talking about children's rights, mental health, closing the gap, a whole lot of issues that are very clearly matters for our entire country. So that's me stealing the limelight because I can. I might now hand over to others.
Before you do, can I just comment on that very last point while I think of it, because I may not think of it later. Just to reiterate that there are a lot of other issues that used to be state and territory issues, and they're no longer state and territory issues. We've made a decision, take gender-based violence as an example. The problem with this one, problem with children and both child protection and youth justice, both of them are the Commonwealth is hands off, is because there's no electoral benefit for them. There is no benefit in getting involved. In fact, you're probably likely to get slammed, or governments get slammed on these issues. So you can kind of understand that our Commonwealth government colleagues, they're not rushing to get involved, right? And they were probably dragged to the table on gender-based violence, for example, anyway. Eventually they had to get involved. So I think for those of us who think that actually this should be a whole of country effort. We need to convince them that this has to be done. And, we're not going to have members of the public walking down the street with placards about this issue. It's not that kind of issue. So really, I've said to the members of Parliament that I've had the opportunity to brief that we need the good MPs to stand up and do the right thing and call on governments to do the right thing, to look at the evidence. In some ways, this strikes me as a little bit like climate change, when we didn't believe the science. So you've got, like Northern Territory, I've done a lot of interviews about the Northern Territory lately with the lowering of the age of criminal responsibility. And it's not based on evidence what they're doing, but that doesn't seem to matter, because it sounds like they're going to be doing something about preventing crime, even though the evidence doesn't support that what they're promising or now doing is preventive of crime by children. So, there are some very, very deep barriers that we're encountering here.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I mean, I think in a way that's a silver lining, at least that there are some precedents for issues that have been difficult to bring up to the Commonwealth level that now are. So I'll turn over, I think it was Lucas and then Hannah with their hands up.
Thanks,
Hi,
Stuart.
Lucas.
Hi, Anne. Thanks very much for your insights and all your work you and others been doing with the Help Way Earlier and other initiatives, obviously. So I'll start with trying to reason what my question is, especially on the points that you were talking about just now, about the sort of lack of or the reluctance from federal government and other government agencies or parties or, to sort of take a leading role in that. And it does seem that is a problem that whoever touches it might lose an election. So it's kind of probably at this point where the world is becoming a little bit more conservative. I mean, that's just my personal opinion, how hard it is to get one government to actually decide to act on it. But on the other hand, and I commend on the report itself that has not only top-down approaches, but also bottom-up, so empowering communities and the young people themselves who are affected by this problem. But I think we have a huge narrative problem in a way that the data points that youth crime in general is decreasing, but recidivism is increasing. But what we see in the media is just a very simplistic way to just say it's getting worse. That's the message we get when we open newspapers, even though the data is not pointing to that. So in your opinion, what do you think might actually kick off the narrative starting to change? I know it's a really difficult question, and I've been sort of reading that in the UK, and again, I'm not at all very informed in what's going on in the UK, but it does seem that has been a little shift in terms of looking at how those systems can rehabilitate as they should. And I wonder if there's, from you, any perspective on what can help the narrative change. Is it a media reform as well as other kinds of reforms? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, it's a very big question, Lucas. You can imagine this is what keeps me awake at night all the time, because it's extremely frustrating that you can't just get them to look at the evidence and go, oh, yeah, we can see now we've had it wrong. We've got to kind of put our gaze upstream and, prevent these problems. To some extent, I have felt that maybe we're reaching a bit of a tipping point. So we've got the Senate inquiry now. That's the first time at the federal level there's been any attention on this, but I'm also aware that Senate inquiries come and go and the government of the day doesn't have to pay any attention, right? So they're not given a lot of weight, but it might be different this time. But also the fact that we've had the 2 tragic suicides in Perth, and really that's how this project began, was when I visited Banksia Hill back in 2022. I can tell that story if there's time later. But again, there's like horror story after horror story after horror story, both about youth justice as well as child protection, and we're still not getting the action. Child protection systems equally are overwhelmed. I mean, you can see how this project was as it was an absolute monster of a project, because as Stuart said, we obviously need to reform the justice system because it's not based on human rights and we're harming children. The most egregious breaches of human rights in this country is what I saw when I visited youth detention centres. So that's got to be fixed. But actually, that on its own is not going to prevent crime. We've got to be doing a whole lot more down here, and in the child protection. It is actually a bit of a monster. And from a political perspective, we need to make it doable for whoever wants. Whoever is motivated to get involved. I actually think it is doable, but it's not doable unless we work together as a federation and we chunk it down, we have a reform roadmap, and we actually systematically move forward, because there are some states that are doing better than others. That's the truth of it. And it is not a party political thing. Tasmania is really doing a lot better now than it was before, and they've got a lot going on. And they're a right-wing government, and then you've got, a couple of other Labor states that are, not doing well because they're Labor states, but because they've got a history of doing things perhaps a little bit more, and maybe they've had fewer problems, But then we've got a bunch of states that they're failing. They are failed states when it comes to the safety and well-being of children, and they're highly vulnerable at election time because the crime rates, the recidivism is so high, 90% in Queensland. A small group, 55% of repeat offenders in Queensland, right? So the Labor government hasn't been able to fix this, and now, the the LNP wants to come in, and they're promising 2 more big institutional children's prisons. They're promising boot camps, adult time for adult crime, and amongst other things, they're now saying, if a child assaults an officer, they're going to have minimum solitary confinement. I mean, that's just breaching every human rights treaty you could think of. And because the politicians are under such pressure, they can get away with saying these things. And because the public doesn't know any better, the public will think, oh, they're going to do something, they're going to fix it. And then finally to the media. The media is a huge problem because they like to publish about crimes, incidents of crimes, because crime sells. So you get more clicks. And when I spoke at the National Press Club about this, I spoke directly to the media, and I said to them, what we need the media to do is to focus more on solutions, not just the incidents of crime. And the way they do the incidents, of course, they show the old footage repeatedly, because I follow this. So you're always seeing the same old footage whenever there's a new crime story. But I can't get them to be interested, by and large, on the solutions, which is what this report is about. It's about the solutions, right? About the foundations of a reform roadmap. And most of the media only just wants to keep reporting on the crimes. And then that puts pressure on the politicians, and then there you get this sloganeering going on at election time. Yeah, it's pretty bad, actually.
Thanks, Anne. And I just wanted to have a quick comment on that. I think the idea of the roadmap is really important and really a way to sort of get us to think about breaking this huge problem in small parts that will actually, each one of those parts, once we achieve them, the situation gets better and better. And when we get to that point, I think society might be in a different sort of way of looking at the problem. And because when we look at the problem, at the end, it looks too big to fix, but I agree that a roadmap is a really good idea of tackling that. Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Lucas.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucas. Hannah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mason Rothwell from Social Reinvestment WA. It's nice to see you, Stuart and Anne. I guess I have a question that's quite similar to Lucas's. Penal populism is really, really strong in Australia, and I think there's an astounding lack of literacy amongst the public that around what actually works. There's a prevailing assumption amongst the public that detention, prisons, and the way that we're operating is working kind of as intended. And for anyone who's engaged in this space, who sees the data and evidence, it's really clearly false. And I think that you're absolutely right. We need to challenge community understandings and change those understandings to pave kind of political roadmaps forward. I'm just wondering, what's your view on where the responsibility lies for changing community attitudes on this? So I've met with a number of ministers and decision makers in a number of different portfolios, whether it's corrections, education, health, mental health, housing. And the line I get back almost unanimously is, I agree with you, this looks great, but I can't do anything unless the public changes their mind, or unless I have carte blanche to do it. They put the onus back on campaigners and advocates, but our reach is necessarily much smaller and we're less resourced. And I know that we do a lot of work in health promotion and in other areas around dispelling myths and increasing public literacy around evidence-based to change behaviour. Why don't we do it in youth justice? So why aren't governments working in that space as well? And I'm just wondering, Anne, what your thoughts are on whether or not governments should be stepping into kind of an evidence-based campaign space to justify doing the right work.
So you're from WA. Did you say Social Reinvestment WA? I love the work that you guys do. I think we met with you as part of the project. So congratulations for your work. I'm smiling because I met with your Premier a few weeks ago. I don't know if you knew we were over there after the second tragic suicide, and I used the opportunity to sort of basically give him my report. He was, and then he put it in front of him, and I kept directing the conversation to that. But at one point, and he did exactly what you just said. He agrees. He doesn't disagree, right? But he said, we've got an election coming up in March. And I said, but Premier, the research shows that actually most people would support you if you got out there and said, this is the approach we need to take. We need to change course and do it differently. Even victims and victims advocates that I've spoken to, they don't want to lock up more children. They want better prevention and early intervention. That's what they're calling for. And it's a very small percentage of people only think, I'll just lock them up, get them out of sight, keep them locked up. I mean, there is that element, but it's a minority. So I said to the Premier, you'd actually have the backing of the majority if you did that. Oh, but, election. No courage right now. And of course, if they don't win with a big majority, I believe it's going to be a slim one, if they win, then they're not going to have the courage after the election either. So this is the bind that we're in. There's never a good time to make that courageous step and tell the truth, tell the public the truth. And that's what we need to do. And you're right, you're absolutely on the money about that, Nathan, in that the public, because the media doesn't tell them the truth and the political leaders don't tell them the truth, then they're in the dark. Those people who think that what the current approach is the right approach, well, we've kept them in the dark. So I think collectively we can be calling them out on that and saying, that's not the evidence. So, for example, I was asked many times when the CLP won in the Northern Territory on the promise of lowering the age, the question that was put to me was, well, doesn't Leah Finocchiaro have a mandate to lower the age? She's won resoundingly, 17-seat majority. She's saying she's got a mandate. What do you say to that? And what I say to that is, they won on a mandate to prevent crime by children. The mandate is to prevent crime. What they are doing or promising to do is not based on the evidence of what will prevent crime. We just have to keep repeating that again and again and encouraging the media to, amplify the truth, right? And this is not going to happen overnight. And it's really way too slow for my liking. I am incredibly frustrated, as I was telling Stuart earlier. But yeah, maybe there will come a time when there'll be a government prepared to do what you're suggesting, and that is actually do a community awareness campaign about this. But, again, what's in it for them at the moment? What's in it for them? Politics is a very self-interested game. It's the reason why the Commonwealth government refuses to get involved is because there's no electoral benefit for them. Zero. So they're happy to let the states flounder. And if I'm frank, they're happy to let these kids be sacrificed. And that's not okay.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you call a spade a spade. And thanks, Mason. Mason, looks like you were going to say something else there. And if I can just say, I think one of the many important messages I'm taking from what you've been saying is the importance of us all singing from the same hymn book, and perhaps right now that is the Help Way Earlier report. If we can all be saying the same thing and saying it as loudly and frequently as possible, perhaps that will help to move the dial at least a little bit in this space. Matt.
Excuse me. I got probably a very naive question about this. Is that what about if there's no political will? How about maybe approaching the state governors and what their roles are within their powers to actually put a bit of pressure on it? Because I'm also in WA, and I'm looking at the Government House website right now, and the WA governor's responsibilities are like representation of the community engagement and advocacy as some of his responsibilities. So have you considered maybe approaching those officers and seeing if they could collectively put pressure on the state governments to act?
Well, what I have done is I have worked with the previous Governor General and met with him many times. I haven't been able to get in to see the current Governor General. They have some influence, but they don't, it's up to them whether they get involved in particular issues, of course. And given how highly political all of this is, many of them are reluctant. As for the state governors, it's not a bad idea. I haven't personally approached any state governors at this point, but as you know, we have children's commissioners in every state and territory. And what I might do, Matthew, is actually just check which of them have spoken with their state governor about child justice reform. I will do that because it's not a bad idea. I mean, it's part of making sure everybody is aware, and lifting the general level of awareness. It's not like they're going to intervene and tell the government what to do, but they might ask some interesting questions when the time is right. So, I absolutely think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, they could ask some awkward questions at appropriate times.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and they do have some clout, on these. Interestingly, when we did the launch of this report at Parliament House, Dame Quentin Bryce came, so former Governor General. I mean, it's not that these are often people who have an interest in social justice and are intelligent people, who, professionals in their own right. So they have something to contribute for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Matt. That sounds like a good suggestion. Mary.
Oh, thanks so much. Hello, Anne. Lovely to see you. Mary from the Canberra Restorative Community. And thanks so much for your presentation. You're doing such important work, so please just keep going. You may have heard Dr. Stephen Kennedy, Secretary of Treasury, in August, give an address to the University of South Australia, basically steering policymakers to draw on restorative justice as a site of evidence for policymakers. And it seems as though if we have the Secretary of Treasury saying, quoting the RISE experiments of Canberra in the 1990s and saying that restorative justice, which we know those recommendations, I think, were mentioned. I think there were sort of 268 mentions of restorative justice in the Victorian law reform work and the Royal Commissions, and we have seen very prominent Indigenous researchers such as Dr. Shireen Hamilton, Ngunnawal researcher who advocates and works very closely with elders in elder-led research, promoting such approaches. So I guess I'm just wondering, are we going to see more discussion around restorative approaches? I think we've got someone like Stephen Kennedy promoting it, suggesting we need to be looking at it. I think this issue of the Commonwealth and states, I think this is a really interesting one, because we hear the Commonwealth saying, well, child protection's a state responsibility and youth justice, but we don't, and we hear the states saying to the Commonwealth, stay out of it, it's our turf. I guess the thing that really I wonder why we're not really looking at is actually the relationship between, in the UK, they're doing relational audits around service systems. It's not a case of blaming, but it's a case of how are service systems actually working together? What is that relationship between? So if you have the Commonwealth that funds a whole lot of services, health, DV, mental health, domestic violence, drug and alcohol, homelessness, when we know those services are all mandatory reporters and they have to report these families to statutory child protection systems, what we know through our research, which we've been doing through people like Professor Valerie Braithwaite and Nathan Harris at the School of Regulation and Global Governance, is that a lot of these services that are meant to be empowering services for families, often Commonwealth funded, the sort of decision making around the removal of a child with child protection is made totally by the child protection authority. So the decisions are made in isolation. Services, families, and certainly the children's voice are not at the table. So it just seems as though we need to have a much better understanding of that decision-making process between services, statutory and Commonwealth funded. But the other sort of subset of that comment is looking at the report. Hopefully you'll all be familiar with the South Australian work that's being done with Ngawitja family-led decision-making in South Australia, and they're getting really amazing results there. Over 90% of families not re-engaging with the child protection system, and over 90% of family-led decision-making plans being rubber stamped by child protection. So you've got family-led. Central is the voice of the child, and that the child's voice is being heard in those family-led conferences. So I guess that as a restorative approach and as a restorative mechanism. And I'm just wondering how you see your role and the new National Indigenous Children's Commissioner, I guess, sort of promoting practices such as family-led decision-making across the Commonwealth and the states.
So there was a lot in that. So I'll just address that. Yeah, absolutely. Our recommendation 13 is about restorative justice, and I've seen in jurisdictions like New Zealand where it is a standard requirement for every child that goes to court, I think it's before court. They have to have a restorative justice session before court, but they can also have it after court. Across Australia, the family conferencing, restorative justice sort of landscape is incredibly mixed. And, I've seen places where they're done by police, the restorative justice sessions are done by police. And there's very few Indigenous trained restorative justice facilitators. We need more of them. And those family-led decision-making approaches, we are seeing more of those in some of the jurisdictions. Absolutely. There's a whole bunch of things we could be doing, right? But we know what Australia's like. It's a patchwork. There's little bits of good practice all over the place, but, it's not system-wide. We don't sort of say, okay, every kid needs to have an opportunity for a restorative justice conference, with their family and everybody there, right? We could do that, but we don't. So, just a comment on the relational audits you said in the UK and about reforming our decision-making processes. Well, that's what you would do if you were looking at those early upstream systems and the child protection system all along the way. If you were making them fit for purpose, then you would be redesigning them along those lines. That's what you'd be doing, right? But we don't have any systematic way of achieving that. And some states are forging ahead and some states are not.
I guess when we've got the Secretary of Treasury sort of pointing us, and we've done cost benefit analysis of, anywhere between, I think for every $1 spent, we can see a saving of between $4 and $11 when we're pouring $8 billion into a child protection system.
So sorry, you've done it, or you've done the cost benefit analysis?
It's been done by the University of Canberra.
Canberra, yes.
Several, yeah.
Absolutely. By the way, are you able to send me Stephen Kennedy's speech? Because I didn't know. I didn't know about that. If you have my email address, I think.
Do. Yeah.
But I think I'll just say one thing about cost benefit analyses. I mean, I've been around through different shades of government over many years, and I've never seen cost benefit analyses actually work when it comes to lifting up child safety and wellbeing. And I have challenged a number of MPs about why, because the data is very strong, of course, in terms of the lifetime costs of an individual who we failed in childhood. When I've challenged MPs about that, they basically say to me, "Oh, it's because there's no votes in children." Now, that means that there is no economic electoral benefit for them, even if the data shows the benefit economically. There's no electoral benefit when it comes to issues affecting children. So there is a cultural blindness about the value of children and childhood. We don't have a very widespread understanding of what child development is even all about. And that's how we can get away with policy measures that basically treat these kids like adults. A kid who does a crime, treat them like an adult, punish them. I have people say to me, "We have to punish them and then they'll stop doing crime." Well, we don't understand how it works with kids. And that's why I think sometimes economic benefit analyses don't work. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do them and have them ready on the shelf to pull out, because the window might open and that might be the very thing that helps the Member of Parliament, push something through. Yeah, but great insights. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. It's there was a lot there. As this conversation evolves, I keep swinging between cautious optimism and desperation. So, look, I'm mindful that we've got Hayley and then Margarita with her hands up. Hayley, please go.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, for the work that you've been doing. You've partly just answered my question, so I won't hop on too long. But I was involved with Carol Bauer, Fiona Stanley, Shirin Hamilton, who Mary just mentioned, with the work looking at disability amongst kids at Banksia Hill. So diagnosing fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and a range of other neurodevelopmental impairments. And so much effort was put in from our team, from the research team, into advocacy and meeting. As Mason said, their team have done meeting with all of the ministers, and getting that same response of, yeah, this is great, but actually it doesn't sit within our portfolio. It sits, somewhere else. And one of the things that helped a little bit with traction was using the states against each other. So part of my work was to train the frontline justice staff about neurodiversity and about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I went across 4 states and territories to do that. But a lot of them would say, "Oh, well, if South Australia is doing that, yeah, we can do that too." So that was something that, we found useful at the time, although, now it's a little bit different. But I guess my question, or I'm hoping for advice from you, is to how academics can be most helpful here. And I was going to ask, is it the economic argument that we need to do? Is it, the having evidence that's purely focusing on solutions and really focusing on that road mapping, what's the pathways to success, rather than uncovering problems, which I think they're inundated with? How can we be best helpful in a part of what's happening here nationally?
Hayley, it sounds like you've done a lot of work already, so I'm not sure that we can ask too much more of you, but it's all of that, really. It's all of that. It's seizing every opportunity to educate about the facts, about the evidence, and that includes the economic benefit evidence. That's part of the evidence. And remembering, if you keep in mind, the public doesn't know the truth. The public does not know the truth, or not enough of the public knows the truth. So it needs every one of us I often say we need to speak with one voice for children. We need to actually keep pushing the truth out through whatever channels we've got, and to keep doing it. I had so just a quick anecdote. I know we're running out of time, Stuart, but I'll give a quick story about Scotland. So you may have seen the media that showed that Scotland no longer has kids in detention at all. From a couple of weeks ago, I had the former Children's Commissioner from Scotland on a round table only on Monday. And that'll be available if anyone's interested. I'm happy to send the link for you. And, of course, we asked him questions about, well, how did you get there? How did you manage to close all your youth detention centres and all of that? And what he described basically was a 20-year journey. 20 years of advocacy and pulling together across the different sectors. So, unfortunately, our advocacy community in Australia probably mirrors the fragmentation in government policy. So we have your health advocates, we have your education advocates, we have your raising the age of criminal responsibility, single issue advocates. We have all these different advocates, but it's very hard to get everyone together under a single umbrella when it matters, to speak with one voice for children. And so, and it takes a long time. Now, of course, we're not beginning from year zero. I know people have been working on this, as you described, for many years. But it does take a long time. But I think the thing is we need to back each other in. So as Stuart said earlier, if when you're out there talking, you mention the Helpway Earlier report, because it's pulled together so much from around the world and across the country, it's a start. It's only a start. We only had we didn't have many resources. We did the best we could with what we had. But it is a start, and hopefully an easy read for someone, for a member of parliament, who can go, oh, okay, here's some other ways we need to think about this, and then build on that. So, back each other's work in and keep telling the public the truth.
Thanks, and thank you, Hayley, for that question. As a researcher, it's always great to get some advice on how to be useful. I think, Margarita, you may be the last question coming from your car.
Sorry for this. Thank you so much, and for your presentation, and Stuart for facilitating this insightful discussion. I'm Margareta. I'm working on school mental health here in Indonesia. I'm also want to contribute in my country about how to support this, to identify these children at school. So what happened here in this context, most of the behavioral problem that we often can identify are addiction related to opiate and marijuana, because here possession and usage also considered as criminal activity. So what happened with these children, the students identified in schools? Sorry, can you hear me all right?
Yes, keep going.
Okay.
Yes.
So what happened is sometimes school can identify, and after that they refer that we have this national authority on addiction, and in between those referral section, they just be at the revolving doors between community service or maybe parents, lack of information, the support from national authority of narcotics, but they're not really having support. So to your knowledge and experience, what are the best practices that school can do to support, not only identify, but actually giving them support so they don't relapse and continue in this path?
So
thank you.
I know we've got limited time. Thanks, Margareta. I'll try to answer very quickly. Again, in the Helpway Earlier report, there's a number of recommendations that focus on health. And in particular, I'd like to draw attention, based on your question, to the connection between health and education. So Australia, unlike some other countries, we don't put those two together. There other countries, they will have a health centre, a whole of family health centre in the grounds of the primary school and the high school. They go together, and for obvious reasons, right? Because you can't ask teachers to do everything, right? Especially, teachers are overwhelmed. But if they have very close by, if not there, but you are working closely with health professionals, then they can provide that dual approach that recognises that children's needs don't sit in one portfolio, they sit across the portfolios, health and education in particular. So very much this idea of integrating health and education in the local community to make sure that kids and their families get the help they need, because kids have said to me that the adults in their families can't get help for drug and alcohol and mental health issues, so they're worried about their parents. And I'll just finish by saying, and I obviously can't comment on Indonesia, but I'll just tell a story briefly, Stuart, when I was in the Kimberley last week. And what I heard about was the increasing rise of drug addiction in the Kimberley, in particular ice, and a lot of concern about addictions in that area and the lack of services for children, the lack of detox rehabilitation services for children. And I was told directly that the only way a child can get help for their drug addictions is to commit a crime, then they get sent to Banksia Hill, and they get healthcare now in Banksia Hill because things have improved a bit within that centre. But of course, then they come back and then there's nothing again. And what happens? Well, it's repeated. The cycle is repeated. But there is no proper mental health or substance abuse services for the kids who need it in the Kimberley. And I guess that sort of summarises the whole story. That we are using the criminal justice system as the only system to respond to these children. And that's why we're in the deep trouble that we're in this country.
Thank you, and that's a very powerful way to respond. Margarita, thank you for the question. We are just about at time, and I've found this absolutely fascinating, and I just want to thank you once again for your time and your expertise, as well as everybody who made a comment or asked a question. Clearly, we're not going to solve all of this in this hour, but I think that this is, I've come away from this a little better informed and with some optimism and a desire to keep sticking at it. And I think we're stronger if we work together. Look, I just want to share in the chat, we do have fortnightly webinars where we do try to create a platform for ongoing engagement and discussion of these issues. And I'd encourage everyone just to bookmark that and come along if you can. But and just please allow me to thank you one more time. And before we let you go, I just want to invite you if you have any last comments or remarks that you'd like to make.
Oh, well, I'd just like to say thank you and congratulate the Justice Health Group and the great work that you do. And I'm really pleased that you feel optimistic after this conversation, Stuart, because sometimes I worry that it's all doom and gloom. I go away and I go, oh my God, I just left people with, a sense of dread, because sometimes it feels that way. But I hope you also hear that whilst I'm very aware of the big mountain that we're climbing, I do remain optimistic, and it's because there are people like yourselves who really are committed to change, and we just need to make sure that we get those messages heard by the people who need to hear them again and again and again, and eventually, and I've seen this happen in other areas of policy, the window opens and you've got to be ready to drive a truck through it. That's what I reckon. Thanks very much.
That's a great way to end. Thank you very much, Anne. Everyone, please join me in thanking Anne.
Thanks very much, everyone.